Good morning. President Carter has entered into hospice at the time of this recording, and we wish him well. He was a president in the upper half of the 1970s, and that's an era that's so important for our anecdotes here. It seems inappropriate to talk politics at a time like this, but since, although it starts out rather rude, it ends up quite complimentary towards President Carter, and so we hope he doesn't mind. Well, let's get started. Decades ago, when I would listen to the hotshot professionals, the professors of economics and those sorts of people, they would say that President Carter is going to go down as one of the worst presidents in the history of the country. He was a complete failure. When it came to economics, inflation was just running rampant. Houses were going up as much as $2,000 a month, and that's one of the things I remember to get a handle on it. There were factories that were being abandoned in the northeastern part of the country, and that was simply unimaginable until then. Children were being poured into poverty, and there was an explosion of single moms. At the national level, President Carter was trying to help the people in Central America, especially Nicaragua, fight for democracy, and he was supporting the commandos who were fighting for Nicaragua. And once again, Ortega, I think, was the name of the communist. And once again, Ortega won wholesale. And once again, they brought communism to Nicaragua. And once again, Carter was a complete failure. In the Middle East, Carter was trying to bring peace between the Israelis and the Egyptians at the time with peace accords, and he worked like mad at it, and it turned into a complete failure. And again, in the Middle East, I believe it was Iran, they overthrew a king who was an ally of the United States, replaced him with the Ayatollah Khomeini, I think his name was, and they took over the embassy over there, and they took hostage the employees at the embassy and held them for months. There was a military rescue attempt, but it all turned out to be a complete failure. To continue, when President Carter was running for re-election in 1980, he came out, he was being criticized for being soft on the military. He wouldn't fund the B-1 bomber, I think the name of was. And so he came out and made public the idea that the United States, they had stealth bombers. Evidently, the Air Force were decades ahead of anybody else. They could fly wherever they wanted to. And they didn't want the money for the Air Force didn't want the money for the B-1 bomber. They wanted the money for their stealth bombers. And they were so secret, nobody knew about them, and Carter made them public to make himself look better for the election. In all fairness, the pros would say the only president, every president does that, and the only exception was the president that ran against Carter in 1976. He had a chance to make the economy look good, as the presidents do, but it had a long-term negative effect, and so that president wouldn't do it, and he paid a dear price for it. He lost the election. What else is, I mentioned that because there's a sense of, well, being normal, or for want of a better way of saying it, and so we mention it. It is what it is. What else is true of President Carter? He sent his child to public school. If he was going to be a president, he would send his child to public school, and if public schools weren't good enough for the president, they weren't good enough for anybody. And that was the attitude. He stood up for those core values. He represented the average Joe. Just like the two presidents that came before him, and just like the president that came after him, even though they looked completely different, when they got down to the very basics of it, the core values, they were all the same. He was for the average Joe. He was for the working class being the middle class, and that middle class being in a circle that floated well above the poverty line. You didn't burn the American flag or fly it every day. You flew it on the holidays, and he was in the same, following in the footsteps of Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, and so were those other presidents you were mentioning. He had those core values, and that's what he represented. And he lost. well, wait a minute, there's something wrong with all of this. Since this anecdote is getting a bit long, well, let's continue it in the next anecdote, and we'll say the same thing, only we'll say it with a bit of a different perspective.